Welcome to Building People, Companies, and Careers, brought to you by AccruePartners. I'm Amy Pack.
And I'm Patty Comer. We're your host on this journey through the vibrant business landscape in the Queen City.
This podcast is an extension of our mission statement at AccruePartners, where we have spent over 20 years fostering connections and building relationships.
Whether you're a client, candidate, or business influencer in Charlotte, this podcast is for you.
We are immensely grateful for your support throughout our journey, and now through this podcast, we're excited to share the stories that have defined our path.
So let's dive in.
Let's do it. If you're gearing up for an interview, whether it's for a full-time role, a consulting project, or an interim position, this episode is for you. Today, I'm joined by two of AccruePartners' most senior recruiters, providing over 32 years of combined experience, helping both clients and candidates navigate the interview process with clarity and confidence. You'll hear their insider tips on how to prepare effectively, how to tailor your story to the role you're interviewing for, and how to clearly communicate the impact you're ready to make. We'll also cover common mistakes to avoid because the goal is simple: to help you show up prepared, polished, and ready to land the job. This is practical, real-world advice straight from the pros who do this every single day, so stay tuned. Without further ado, let's welcome our special guests, Greg Speidel and Evan Lambeth.
Thanks, Amy. Really looking forward to this conversation.
As am I. Thanks, Amy.
All right, let's take it away.
Well, my name's Greg Speidel. I've been here at AccruePartners 11 years. I am a executive recruiter within the accounting and finance space. So we work with companies that are here locally in the Charlotte area, but also on a national scale, finding them high-level talent in that particular industry.
Great. Thanks, Greg.
My name's Evan Lambeth. I'm the EVP of Talent and Delivery Solutions here with AccruePartners. I've been with the company for 4 years, additional 8 years in the business, so 12 total. But I lead recruiting and delivery strategy and execution across all 5 lines of business and 3 service offerings with Accrue.
Great. So as you can see, we've got the experts with us today.
So, Greg, related to interviews, let's start at the beginning.
Yeah.
What would you advise a candidate to do before the interview actually is scheduled? You're working with Accrue. How do you prep them in advance of the interview?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is obviously one of the most important things in getting a job today: preparation.
Yep.
Right? Preparation's key. That's what you hear growing up to do well in things. And, I think people who take the prep part of the job seriously, really shows in the interview itself. So, we'll kind of talk through what we feel is, the best steps is prep. And I think number one, in my opinion, is, once you put your resume out there, you get a call back from the company, get the time scheduled for the interview. Step one is really, learn more about the company.
Do your homework.
Right? You want to know the good details about the company you're talking to, who you're talking with, so you go into it and you can impress them with your knowledge.
So what is that detail, Greg? The company size, revenue, are they publicly traded, private equity backed, family owned? What's their story in the marketplace, right? How long have they been in business? What are some other things you're looking at, from industry to recent acquisitions, M&A activity? Talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think looking, news articles, right? Anything that you can show that you've taken that extra step to learn more about them, is really going to impress whoever you're talking to.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to just show up and say, yeah, I know the company and, this is what they do and that's it, right?
Yeah.
That's not really showing that you're interested in who you're interviewing with.
Yeah. Well, it even gets to, we'll talk about this later, but, when a company asks you, why us, right?
Yeah.
You've got to do your homework to be able to answer that question. Okay, so we talked about doing your homework kind of advance of the interview. Now we're at the interview phase. So we've got to actually start prepping for the role that we're interviewing,
Yep.
Not only tailoring our responses to that, but kind of thinking in advance of the interview, what are some common interview questions that you might even be asked? And again, tailoring a narrative around that. So I always like to go back to the preparation in advance that maybe you've done with your resume and telling that story. Internally, we say made, saved, then achieved, but what we're really talking about is quantifying and qualifying your professional achievements. Greg, what are some tips and tricks that you give related to candidates to be able to storytell and quantify some of those accomplishments?
I mean, I always say have facts, right? Like have concrete examples of things that you've done,
Yep.
whether that's Save money. Hey, I saved money for this amount during this year, right? Like, you don't want to go into it and embellish, lie, make anything up, because at the end of the day, that'll get flushed out during the interview. So, even if it's just a few achievements, right? Like, if you have two, if you're a younger professional, you've only done one thing that you really feel, but you're passionate about it, bring that up. That's what's going to, show them that you're really, a strong candidate.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great advice. I think one of the common pitfalls that I see with folks going into interviews when I'm doing the preps for them is their resume will say this, and we have to coach them on that, but then they'll verbally say, I worked on this project, period.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, what's the follow-up? Again, you touched on, I made money. I worked on this project, and we had the end goal of creating $10 million in EBITDA for the year. Okay, so how did you accomplish it? That's that storytelling and that second and third level that we want to get into in the interview, so they're able to tell that story.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to happen. Like, you get an interview and you forget things, right?
Yeah.
You get nervous, and so a good tip is maybe write it down on a piece of paper. If you're doing a Teams interview, odds are they can't see what's directly right in front of you. So practice ahead of time. Have a cheat sheet in front of you so that you can not have a brain fart during the interview and completely forget whatever you were talking about.
Yep. One of the first questions that you might get in an interview is, tell me about yourself.
Yeah.
I think we highlighted a very brief version of that here in the podcast today, but what are some tricks or tips related to tell me about yourself? I mean, I know personally, I always advise folks to keep it relatively short, keep it professional, maybe sprinkle in a little personal stuff in there, but just to keep it light or break the mood or maybe make a connection with who you're interviewing with. But any thoughts there?
Yeah, I always tell people you want to cover a good amount in this question, but you also don't want to spend your whole interview on this question, right? Some people go overboard. If you've got a 45-minute Teams interview, you don't want to spend the first 30 talking about yourself and not give the interviewer time to interject, right? So it's always, I always tell people, high-level overview of your background, right? But you don't want to skim through it so fast that you don't cover things.
Sure.
And then just put in some relevant information to what you're interviewing for. So, let's say if you're interviewing for an analyst role and you're currently an analyst, but you start out as a junior analyst, like, you want to make sure you cover that as a progression in your background.
Would you say, and Amy, I'm curious to hear your thoughts around this, would you say that's one of the things that you should already have kind of in your back pocket or trained to tell that story to a certain degree?
Yeah, I would say that's probably the one question that stumps most people. They don't want who's interviewing you. You don't want to regurgitate everything on your resume, because that's what the interview's for.
And they've got your resume right in front of them.
Yeah, so just give them enough knowledge to get interested in you. Maybe highlight some things about you that aren't necessarily found on your resume.
Yep.
But stay away from things that are not important, such as religion, family matters, and things of that nature that could get a little bit dicey and are not really important to the interview. Could be an interest that you have associated with what the company makes or distributes, an article that you've read recently, or blogs tied to their industry. But I would say keep it interesting at a high level.
Professional associations, boards.
Yes, exactly.
Let's even take it a step further back. We talked about preparing for the interview, but Greg, Amy, what would you suggest people wear into an interview? We're kind of in a changing dynamic. Guys aren't wearing suits anymore, or ties in particular.
Yeah.
I always say business casual, business professional, depending on the client. Now, I know them, of course. You as a candidate, if you've applied on your own and not working with a firm like AccruePartners, you might be on your own there. But I mean, I always suggest be conservative and overdress for the occasion. But how do you show up for an interview?
I always say you want to dress to impress who you're interviewing for. You don't want to dress to not get the job.
Sure.
Right? You can wear something that's going to turn somebody off real quick. So you always want to dress as nice as possible and then have them tell you, hey, you look great today, but, we're a business casual environment.
So like no loud patterns.
Yeah.
Nothing excessive. And by the way of jewelry or anything that could distract. Not to say don't wear any jewelry, but keep it conservative, keep it light.
Yeah. Yeah. Keep it, tamed, right?
Yeah.
Like, just make it not a distraction.
Yep.
Hey, how about this? If you're questioning it, probably don't wear it.
Good bit of advice.
Another thing I would share, especially with females, fashion always gets females in trouble. always. I'm a female. I can speak to it, but you're better off to be conservative, if you will, and overdress, as you said. But I'll go back to the females. They want to be fashionable, trendy, and that's not always the most professional. And you're leaving yourself open to a lot of judgment if you're not careful there. So be, on the side of conservative, if that is. And again, if you have to question it, it's probably not the right thing.
Yeah.
And ask others their opinion. Try things on. How do you feel about it? And I often tell men, they'll say, do I wear a sports coat or should I wear a suit? And my answer to that is either one's probably fine based on what I know about my client, but wear the one that you're going to perform the best in and that you feel the most comfortable in.
And confident.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And
so
make sure that if you are going to wear a suit, make sure you try it on the day before.
Yeah. Right. Make sure it's pressed, make sure it's cleaned. Since COVID, even before COVID, but I mean, COVID accelerated the prevalence of virtual interviews, especially for a first round. It's very rare that we see first round interviews happen in person, right? So preparing for that first round interview over Teams, Zoom, however you're connecting, what do you need to do there? I mean, obviously we talked about the dress code, but what about your background and surroundings? Are you advising candidates to be conscious of kind of what they're displaying behind them?
Yeah. You don't want to show up for an interview with empty pizza boxes behind you.
Right.
Right.
True story.
You want beer bottles in the background, nothing like that, right? Like you want, the Teams has the backgrounds that you can plug and play in, and that's, the easiest way to go. Again, you don't want to draw negative attention to yourself, and Teams is, a platform that everybody uses these days.
Yeah.
So, especially when you're interviewing, make sure you log in 10 minutes ahead of time, make sure it works, make sure it's not pointing up your nose.
Yeah.
Just some of those small things like that.
You mentioned the kind of preloaded or stock backgrounds that Team or any other Web Connect video software offers, but we talked about distractions in the way you dress as well.
Yeah.
I've spoke to people before that they're in their home office and behind them they have a wall full of miscellaneous knickknacks, God knows what, right? That can be distracting too.
Yeah.
So you use the blur function, use the stock background, not the crazy ones like you're on outer space, but something professional.
Yeah.
So I'll add one thing to that from a candidate perspective. If you're not going to be in front of your computer and you're in a non-traditional space, and this is a true story, maybe you have to take the call from your car.
Yep.
Because you're on a break or lunch or something of that matter, let the interviewer know. So if you're working with the firm, let the firm know so they can let the client know. If you're interviewing on your own, let that company know, hey, I'm super appreciative of the opportunity to interview. I'm going to have to take this call from my car. I will be on camera, but I will be on my phone. Yeah. And I say that from a real life story. I unfortunately had a senior level, C-level candidate not advance forward in the interview process because he was having to take the call from his car, and our client felt that was unprofessional, but he was in an executive in the construction industry, and he had to be on the job site. Yeah. And at the end of the day, he didn't have an option, and he was just doing the best he could do. Had I known that in advance, I could have communicated it to the client. Or if you're not working with a firm, you can at least set the precedent so they know. So things do happen and their circumstances do arise, but it's all about communicating that so that you can manage through the challenges.
Yep.
Yeah.
You need to show up 5 minutes in advance minimum to make sure that your connection is working, audio feed is good, video feed is good. I can't tell you how many times I've had technical issues with a candidate joining at noon on the dot when the interview was supposed to start. But, it took us 3 or 4 minutes to resolve that issue with Teams or whatever it may be. So typically the recruiter should jump on to kickstart the interview as well, even if they're dropping off after, we've made our quick round of introductions. But show up early for video or just the way you would or for an on-site interview. Last thing before we kind of transition into actually the meat and potatoes, if you will, of the interview itself and helping you prep for that. One thing that I think that we didn't touch on yet that's really important is we talked about doing your homework on the company itself. Do your homework on the people that you're interviewing with.
Absolutely.
So what does that look like? If you're working with AccruePartners, I'm going to share the LinkedIn profile of that person that you're interviewing for, that director, that hiring manager, that C-level executive, whomever it may be, so you can see their background, experience. I think that helps candidates a lot of times make that personal connection too, right? Maybe you have a mutual connection. Maybe they play golf together. Maybe they went to the same college. Maybe they serve on a board or have similar interests. So I think that's an important thing to know who you're talking to beyond just the company itself. Now, getting into the interview itself, right? We always advise candidates to stick to the starch method where you can. I mean, it's not always applicable, but when you're asked a direct question, Greg, tell me about a time you worked on a project, or tell me about a time that you had a challenge or a difficult teammate. The starch method is a great way to a great framework to use to conceptualize that and tell a story. We've done our homework. We're ready for the interview. The starch method, situation, task, action, response, and change. So starting out with the situation, you're asked a question. Tell me a project that you worked on where you experienced a challenge or a difficulty, or you drove it to success, whatever it is. It doesn't really matter. This is just a framework for you to onboard the question and put it in this framework where your answer is very clear and direct in terms of what they want. So the situation, I worked on this project, or we were working on this major project, implementing a new system, revamping AR, AP processes, whatever the case is. The task, this is what I actually did, right? Or me and the group did. This was the work stream we were delivering on. So talk about that, right? The action, again, some of the tasks that you took, get more granular there and say, I did these things specifically to advance it forward, right? After action is response or results. That's where you actually delivered the work on time and under budget. Or I think this is an important thing to acknowledge in an interview. Acknowledge the mistakes or the challenges, right? That shows growth, and we'll get to that in the change piece. The change is, what would you have done differently? So let's say this project went off 95% without a problem, right? When you're around other professionals, typically that is the case. You all are kind of responsible for your work stream. Everybody does their piece, and usually it's a good job. But there's always challenges, whether it be a challenging teammate or a vendor that you're working with that maybe didn't come through on their end of the bargain. Could be numerous different things, but acknowledge that and then talk about what you learned from that and what you would change in the future. So we had this challenge, or I had a mistake or a stumble here. Here's what I learned from it, and here's what I do differently in the future. It kind of humanizes you a little bit and kind of shows that you're thinking through what those changes in actions or behaviors would be in the future.
Yeah. I mean, you realize that not everything always works out. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, being relatable, admitting to, when things go wrong or have gone wrong. And the hiring manager is going to relate to that, right? Because you could say, hey, our project was this. Our goal was to get it to, X, Y, Z, but we fell short because of this and that, right? And that'll allow for the manager to say, yeah, same thing happened to us, right? Like, we've had issues like that in the past.
And the response and the results piece really speaks to what we spoke about earlier, Greg, with quantifying your professional achievements, right? It's not, I just worked on this project, period. It's, we actually delivered a result. We reduced the time it takes to do something by 30% by automating those AP and AR processes, or we generated revenue because we worked through a business transformation that changed the way that we do whatever it is, right? So really important to have those numbers quantified, dollar signs, percentages, whatever it is. So, yeah.
So back to what Greg said earlier, know your made, saved, and achieved. If you don't know your made, saved, and achieved, it's going to be really hard for someone to work through that starch method.
Yep.
In a concise format. And, one thing I do tell candidates always, yes, you want to storytell in the interview and with the starch method, but if you give too many details, people are going to get lost in the details and they won't remember what's important. So that's where the made, saved, and achieved is extraordinarily important in the starch method. And I like to say, talk in bullet point format. Think about, okay, if I'm going to write this out in bullet point, what does it look like, so that you can be more direct, more concise, and so people can leave the interview remembering what you shared with them.
Land the plane. Okay, so great advice there. I mean, I think as well, don't ramble, right? To Amy's point exactly, you want to keep your responses somewhere between like 90 to 120 seconds. So at most, we're talking a couple minutes here, right? Anything more than that, you might lose interest, or you might run the risk of, again, rambling and, not tying back to the previous point.
I always tell people, if you feel like you're talking too much, you probably are. Yeah.
Well, you want to keep it conversational. You want to allow the interviewer to ask some questions and create a dialogue.
Yeah, I've had interviews before where I call the manager afterwards. I'm like, oh, how did it go? And they're like, well, I got about 2 words in, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's not a good sign.
So another question that all candidates should be prepared for, because it's kind of a classic outside tell me about yourself, is what are your strengths and weaknesses? And, everybody, I think, is pretty good about their strengths, and they kind of hem-haw around their weakness. And let's be real, we all have weaknesses and gaps and areas to improve upon.
A example in the IT space where I've spent a lot of my career in this business. Let's say you say one of your weaknesses is Excel proficiency. And you're acknowledging that as a weakness, and it's something that's, maybe an intermediate skill for the job that they're interviewing for. They don't have to be an expert, but you've got to be proficient. So maybe I'm not quite there yet, but I'm interviewing for this job that requires it. I would say my weakness is Excel, whatever that is, but I'm actively enrolled in a class, or I'm taking a course to turn my weakness into a strength. So then it shows that kind of proactive thinking and approach to being better than yesterday, investing in your own skills, knowledge, learning, whatever it is, technical proficiencies. So I always advise candidates to acknowledge the weakness, but then share what are they doing to turn that into a strength, actually. And it shows that growth and intent.
How about strengths?
I think this one, you want to be... again, conscious of what you're good at. So if the job, but also you want to make it relevant to the job, right?
Right.
So if it's a manager job, you want to go into it and say, hey, I'm really good at team management, at communicating with others, being able to talk, from high level executives down to
Developing people,
and everything like that.
Yeah. Strength should be easy for most people. If they're not for you, maybe you don't have some great strengths and want to think about that. But strengths should be, easily articulated, I think, in most cases. But, you don't want to come off as cocky. You want to say, I'm good at these things, and here are where my strengths lies. But
well, maybe thinking back about strengths, IT people don't like to brag about themselves. Accounting people don't like to brag about themselves, right? Thinking about where someone has had made, saved, and achieved, and what were the skills that they did, or the skills that they had that gave them the ability to really have an impact. Because you do have to speak about what your strengths are.
Yeah.
So that you can speak to the value that you bring the organization and have an impact. Because let's be real, we got to get out of the job description.
Yep.
And what is someone going to do to drive the business, regardless if it's an accountant, a finance person, an IT person, a developer, a program manager, a project manager, a marketing manager, an HR manager, office manager, chief of staff, whatever it is.
You name it.
So I have a quick question. You give candidates the overview of the job in advance as part of our prep. How do you suggest a candidate take that and use that in their preparation? You've got the starch method. You've got the made, saved, and achieved. What are some other suggestions you have that they should do in order to best prepare to think through how their experience is directly aligned to what the client's looking for? Because that's the key at the end of the day.
I think what's really important there with the overview is obviously going through it, working with your recruiter and putting pen to paper or Word document, whatever you want to do. Like, how does your background and experience align with that? If you're working with a recruiting firm like AccruePartners, we're going to work through that process with you and be really close and tight through the process to make sure that we're telling your compelling story before you even have a chance to meet the interviewer, right? That's our job. If you're applying directly online without the support of a recruiting firm, you've got to really differentiate yourself because you're applying against maybe hundreds or even thousands of candidates that are applying to that same job, right?
Yeah.
So, the difference is you have to stand out. You have to be able to tell that story. If you're applying online, you don't really have that opportunity. But if you net the interview, you really want to take that job description and that overview and it's oftentimes in bullet point format as well. So like Amy said earlier, craft your response, or what would you like to articulate about yourself in relation to those requirements, whatever they are, and be able to tell a compelling story as to why you are a fit.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. There's kind of two sides of the story. When you work with a firm, usually we know the cheat code, right? Like we know of this 20 bullet points in their job description, we know which 5 are their most important, right? But if you're applying directly, more or less you want to spend the time, like you can read through it and you'll get an idea based off of like some of the bullet points, what they're really targeting. And it could be like an ERP system. It could be, hey, we want somebody who's got leadership experience. Like you'll see keywords pop out. So really kind of focus in on those.
Well, and that's, when you say that, what comes to mind is that's one of the reasons companies use AccruePartners to find talent, because we can identify the candidates and we've been talking to the candidates and we can pull that information out of their resume and present only the select 3 to 5 that have that information.
Right.
And then we understand on the reverse of that in working with the candidates what's important.
Yeah.
When it's an apply online, the client doesn't know the candidate's quantitative, 5 or 6 things that are really important, or vice versa. Right. So that's where a lot of the value is in working with a firm. So let me ask you this. What should a candidate expect if they get on a call with a recruiter, whether it be AccruePartners or anyone else? They've been given the interview prep details a day or 2 or 3 in advance. They show up for the interview prep call with the recruiter, and they haven't done any homework. What can they expect to get on the other end?
From AccruePartners, big red flag for me if they haven't done any homework. If you're going to show up to the interview prep with me while I am your conduit into this company, if you will, or this hiring manager in particular, right? I want to understand that you've done your homework and feel confident that you're going to not only represent yourself, but also AccruePartners as you make your way into that first round interview. So again, big red flag for me if somebody shows up to an interview prep in 24 hours, they're meeting the hiring manager and they haven't done their homework, who the company is, what are their locations, what's their revenue approximately. And again, you don't need to know the past 100 years of history, but I need you to at least know what do they do? Are they a manufacturing?
They should be prepared to role play with you a 100%. Little bit, because that's what we're here to do. Now, what we don't want to do is prepare someone so much for an interview that they get it and they're really not a good fit.
Yeah.
So it is definitely a delicate dance, but at the end of the day, we're investing a lot of time for our client and our candidate. And if we've gone to that great measure to ensure they have the information they need, the expectation is that the candidate is going to have done their homework. And if not, we can certainly work through it with good reason.
Yep.
But I do think it's important for our clients to know if candidates show up with us unprepared, it's not uncommon that we may say, hey, this is probably not, a great opportunity to move forward with. Yep. And we owe it to the client and we owe it to the candidate because there's a lot of work that goes into it for everybody.
You said something really important there that I do want to touch on briefly, Amy. You said, are we prepping candidates to show up? And I don't know how to phrase this, but
we're not prepping candidates to get the job, because
exactly.
You could prep anybody to get a job that does nobody any work,
right?
Good work,
but we're not
value.
We're not, and I think this is important for our clients or anybody in the marketplace to understand when you're working with a recruiting firm. We're not prepping the candidates to go in and misrepresent themselves or tell a story that's not true related to their background and experience. We're prepping them to come in front of the client and the hiring manager as the best version of themselves, as pre-vetted by AccruePartners. We've done our due diligence, because this is, for me, what separates the apply online and going into the interview blind versus working with a great firm like AccruePartners. Is the difference at that point is you're competing against maybe 3 to 5 tops other candidates that are going in for that same round of interview through AccruePartners or whatever firm it may be. But there's an expectation that the candidates are a fit for that role when they're engaging with AccruePartners.
Well, the client's paying us a fee, whether it's an executive search role, direct hire, project consulting, or interim. The expectation is we have vetted them and we have shared with them what the position is and why it's open and all the details associated with it. And they're expecting us to communicate that to the candidate.
Yep.
Then if the candidate can't appropriately communicate why they're interested, what their parallel experience is, what their starch method is, what their made, saved, and achieved, and all the other things, then, if I were the hiring manager, I probably wouldn't be overly impressed either. And I would want the firm to take action and not waste my time as a client for a candidate to show up ill-prepared.
Yeah.
They could have done that on their own.
The last thing you want to do is get a call from a manager and say, this person showed up and didn't know anything about, they ask questions like pay, is it on-site, is it hybrid? Like those are things that can be covered in the prep very easily.
Right, and should be.
Covered. But they do come up sometimes, and then the client completely throws off the flow of the interview.
Well, and let's be real, like some of the work styles is really in the interview, in the initial interview with us, right before we present them. And I think that's another piece in the prep process that we haven't really touched on is candidates need to know that what we share with them is coming from the client. There's likely little to zero negotiation. So if you actually think you're going to get in the interview and it is a 4-day a week in office and you're going to try to negotiate 3, probably going to be a little bit dead in the water. So, take a lot of heed and advice from what the recruiter is telling you, because they're there to be your advocate for both the candidate and the client to ensure that there's a good working relationship.
And one thing, we've talked about the first round virtual interviews, but one thing I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up is if you're going on site for the interview, regardless of the round, bring copies of your resume, several copies. If you're meeting with 3 different people, you need 4 to 5 copies. Somebody might show up unexpectedly, or you just always want to be prepared with a resume in hand.
Okay, so let's talk about the in-person interview because it is different than virtual. Most people have done a lot of virtual interviews.
Yep.
Right.
What other things are important when you're going on site? Yes, bringing copies of your resume and something to write with is paramount. But what would be some other things you might recommend that candidates take into consideration?
I mean, I would obviously map out ahead of time, right? Charlotte's a big city, growing city. It's not as easy to get around these days, so always make sure you know where you're going, leave ahead of time. Just easy stuff, right?
Help for traffic.
Yeah.
Construction.
You don't want to come in sweating because you ran from your car to get to the interview.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's not a good way to start.
Turn your phone off.
Yeah.
How about not even pull it out?
Yeah. Phone off. You don't want that going off. And then dress appropriately.
Right.
Right? Like again, you want to dress to impress. You want to show up looking sharp and ready to go.
Yeah.
What would be some social cues, whether it's in person or on video, virtual, that you would recommend candidates pay attention to?
Eye contact is the biggest thing for me. Whether on a call or in person, I think you've got to get adept at kind of reading body language, but eye contact is a big thing. Maintain eye contact, not like staring at the person, but a healthy amount of eye contact to show that you're engaged and listening goes a long way. And other subtle cues from hiring managers are them, slightly nodding their head or sitting up straight in their chair upon a certain response that really gets their attention. So key into those things, right? It shows interest and intent. And, if you do catch their intention, kind of press forward with that line of thinking and explore that topic maybe a little further. Maybe that wins you brownie points or kudos with the manager.
Yeah. I think in the in-person, you want to be not so stiff. Like, you prepare to go through the in-person interview, but you don't want to get in there and just feel like you just got to regurgitate all the, things if you're prepared for, but you want it to be natural and flowing. So don't stress out too much. We want to be somewhat loose going into the interview so that you can have an open conversation.
So that's a great transition. Someone is just naturally nervous, right? How do you recommend they work to calm their nerves prior to the interview so that they can show up as naturally as possible?
I think that if you just go in there and tell yourself you just got to be yourself, like knowing who you are and what you bring to the table, and the rest of the stuff's going to come, right? Like, as long as you go in there and you can give your high-level overview of yourself, take some deep breaths ahead of time.
Yeah.
It's so down.
Don't slow down. Don't drink a ton of Red Bull. I don't think you're going to nail the interview.
I think, for me personally, nervousness shows up for me when I'm not prepared, right? If I'm prepared, I don't have nerves or anxiety around whatever it is I'm doing, whether it be an interview in this particular case or anything in life. So the one bit of advice that I would give in terms of calming your nerves in advance of an interview is, if you're prepared, you have nothing to be nervous about, right? So, and I know some people can be more prone to, anxious thoughts, or they really need this job and it's really important to them. But if you're really anxious and nervous, that's going to show up in the interview. So you've got to find a way to deal with those nerves, quiet the mind, and go in there with a confidence that says, I'm going to get this job, right? And impress. So.
All right. So the interview's wrapping up. It's bumping up on an hour.
Yep.
The client asks at the end, what questions do you have from me? And the candidate's thinking, wow, there's 30 minutes worth of information that I could share that he or she did not ask.
Yeah.
How do you suggest the candidate, what questions do you suggest the candidate ask?
Yeah.
And how does the candidate ensure they uncover any objections that may be there?
I mean, I think for me, you always go in with your standard questions, right? 9 times out of 10, the client's going to answer a few of them throughout. But the key, I think what really goes a long way with getting you into the next step, if you bring a notepad, right, have it in front of you as the...
So it's okay to take a notepad.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that if the hiring manager is talking and you hear them say something, but you can't interject at that time, write it down, and then you can bring it back.
Right.
Right. So it shows that you have an active listener. So you can go back to them and say, hey, you mentioned this. Do you mind, going a step further because, I'm curious about that.
Well, in bringing a notepad in or a notebook or something with questions, goes back to the preparedness. They know that you put some thought to it. In that if you are taking notes through the process, that you are listening to what they have to say, you may not be able to get back to all of it,
right,
but at least you could use part of that in your follow-up.
Yeah.
What were you going to add?
Well, I think Greg hit on some important parts there, but I mean, towards the end of the interview process in general, it's not a one-way street, right? It's your chance to interview them as well. Yeah. You've obviously, as a candidate, you've obviously expressed your interest in this job, but I mean, you still have to go in there and vet whether or not you can work with this manager. They're going to be your boss, your direct hiring manager. Do your styles gel? It doesn't have to be a perfect alignment, but can you see yourself working for this person? So you need to have questions teed up and ready to go related to, what is their working style? That stuff doesn't show up on a job description.
Right.
Yeah. One question I always have over the many years shared with candidates to ask at the, close of, are there any concerns that you have that I haven't been able to address?
Yeah.
Because there could be concerns. They didn't know how to ask it, right?
Yeah.
But it's like anything else in life. If you kind of put that out there and you extend that, hey, it's okay to give me some feedback, they're willing to say, well, hey, Evan, you're lacking SAP experience, or Greg, you don't have manufacturing industry experience. And then it's your job. You have the ability to overcome that. But if you don't ask that question, then you don't know what objections could be there.
Yeah. So, Greg, I'm going to ask you a question, and let's have some fun with this one. This one's a little bit unique. You've probably heard stories, or I'm sure you've seen it over the course of your career in multiple different areas and times. But what happens if a candidate is asked an off-the-wall question like, Greg, how many balloons do you think you could fit into a Volvo?
Yeah.
Like, what's your advice on how to answer something like that? That's probably just an icebreaker, and there's no right or wrong answer, right? They just want to see your thought process. Like, What would you say to a candidate if they're given something like that? Because that can throw people for a loop.
Yeah, I always tell people just give them the answer.
Yeah.
A lot of people, it's natural for them to have a follow-up question. Well, do you want to know exactly? Just throw an answer out there.
Right.
Like, they're trying to have fun. They're trying to loosen it up. I mean, I've heard ones where it's like, how many raindrops fill up Lake Norman? What the hell? So many raindrops.
Yeah. But the point is,
find out the answer to that, let me know.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no answer.
Yeah. The point is, they're not looking for a right or wrong answer. They're looking for, how do you deal with stress if I throw something at you that's off the wall? How do you deal with ambiguity? Let me see how your mind works. Let me see how you process this thought.
Yeah.
So again, if you get asked something like that that's off the wall or perhaps nonsensical, just have fun with it. Give a real answer, kind of give it a thoughtful answer. But again, they're not looking for right or wrong. So take it in your stride, have fun with it, and just give them an answer.
Yeah. And there are some interest.
All right. So the interview's over. You leave the building. You close out Teams, whatever it may be. You got to send a thank you note.
Yep.
What are some tips and tricks that you have for thank you notes?
I always say send directly, right? Like you want to be concise in your thank you note. Like doesn't have to be too wordy, right? But you do want to show it. I always say give it a few hours. Like don't send it 2 minutes later.
Yeah, don't send it from the parking lot, 3 sentences from your phone, and no real meaning to it.
Doesn't have to,
It's like the follow-up text after a date. Always wait a couple hours.
yeah, it doesn't have to be a copied one off of, you Google thank you notes and you just copy and paste.
Right.
Like generally put in there, hey, it was great meeting with you. I really liked your thoughts around this or that. Like put in there some things you enjoyed about the conversation.
Yeah.
Not just a very,
Yeah, reiterate the interest and why you would be, valued or the impact you can make on the job and the company.
Yep. And some recruiters, when you're working with a recruiting firm versus yourself, some recruiting firms will send them for you. I don't tell people to do it directly. I don't,
Well, when it comes from a recruiter and not you as the candidate, it makes you as a candidate not look equipped to send an email.
Yeah.
And, a recruiter, can be there to prove it for you. But at the end of the day, this is your way of further showing and demonstrating your capabilities to write. Because let's be real, doesn't matter what you're doing, you're always responding to email, and your communication is how you show up in someone's inbox.
Yeah.
And so that is still part of the interview process. So it should go directly to the client.
Yeah.
In a timely manner, a couple of hours, but not a couple of days.
And all these interview tips and tricks that we talked about, prepping for an interview, they're applicable for if you're interviewing for an executive or direct hire role, for a consulting opportunity, for even maybe a short-term interim contract or staffing type of role. But I think we'd be maybe a little bit remiss if we didn't acknowledge some of the challenges in the marketplace right now. Amy, Greg, could you share with us some of the things that Accrue are doing across all of our different service offerings?
Okay.
Yeah, so I was just talking about this yesterday. While it is a challenging market, you have to work to set yourself apart in a very professional way. As I've said, it is challenging. We would all be remiss not to acknowledge that.
Yep.
But overextending, what's the word I'm looking for? Overextending a lot of drama around that, and that's not really the right word.
Yeah.
But overextending the hardship associated with it can be a bit much. So, you want to be just conscientious of what you're communicating on LinkedIn, of what the processes looked like, but stick to the value you bring. Stick to the made, saved, and achieved. Looking for a job is like, it's sales, right? It's the funnel. The more conversations you put in the top of the funnel, the greater opportunities in conversations for actual interviews or networking will come out of that. But go into each of those conversations prepared, whether it's an interview or networking, and be able to articulate your value. If someone refers you along to someone else for networking, make certain you circle back to them and not only thank them, but tell them the outcome of what that was, because then they'll go, oh, wow, so-and-so actually remembered to follow through on that. Next time I'll continue to refer them other places. So it also helps keep you top of mind.
Yep.
So just don't let the time get you down. Things will turn. But
yes. Well, I think we're already starting to see a shift in some of that, and it's maybe not what a lot of folks listening to this podcast expect. But I love what you said. Lean into your professional network. That's super, super important. Number 2, be open to maybe what you might consider non-traditional opportunities. So what do I mean by that? You've been looking for a direct hire role for a while now, maybe, or maybe you've only considered permanent direct hire opportunities throughout your career. And you're at a mid-career or high-level point in your career. You're a manager, director, or above. One thing that I would encourage folks to, again, is to be open to opportunities. So how does that show up with AccruePartners? It's in our consulting business. We have a lot of value add upstream consulting opportunities that are highly different from what most would consider traditional staff aug or contract type of engagements around business transformation, process improvement, change management, project management at senior and director type level roles, albeit consulting opportunities with maybe an end date.
Well, and some of them are project related, as we were just talking earlier today. And then some of them are interim consultants, right? They need an interim controller or an interim VP of FP&A to get through their uncertain time, if you will. And so those opportunities will give you a candidate exposure to different industries, different work environments, different technologies, helps expand your network. And then as you continue your career journey, once that's over, you could stay that route, or it just demonstrates to other potential employers that you are flexible, that you are adaptable, and now you've got other things in your toolbox that you might not have had before.
And that interim person a lot of times is tapped for the direct hire role when and if it may become available as well. So it's your foot in the door.
Yeah. And you can make contacts, right? Go out there, do a good job on an interim project. You can use them for references, but also they may know other people in the industry if they can help you out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So rapid fire as we close down today's podcast of prepping for interviews. We talked about how to calm your nerves, but why don't each of you share your favorite lunch spot in Charlotte? And it can't be what you order off Postmates.
So we're actually going there.
You're actually going to dine and patron the restaurant.
Simple for me. Bricktops lunch, classic burger. Can't beat it.
Culinary dropout.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's close by. You got to drive to South Park. You're in South End.
Yeah.
Thankfully, a lot of our clients are in South Park. So if anybody wants to meet me at Bricktops, you're about. What about dinner, Greg? The favorite dinner spot in town?
Favorite dinner spot? I like Little Mama's.
Little Mama's?
Oh, yeah, because they give you like 3 portions all in one, and you can eat all that.
Yeah, that's very true.
That one's pretty simple for me as well. Sushi, Nico.
Okay.
Never misses.
All right. And the last rapid fire question, what would be the one piece of a career advice you would give a candidate? We'll start with you, Greg.
That's a good question. The best advice I would give for somebody is to find something that they enjoy doing and try and get, as much down the path as possible. So, if you find out that you like early on, I'm a financial analyst and I like doing that work. If you're earlier in your career, get an internship with it, right?
Right.
And then, get out of your internship, land an entry-level role, but give your jobs time, right? Don't job hop too much. Try and get as much out of, the job you have at that moment before making a change, because you never know what you're going to find if you stay with a company for a long time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I alluded to it earlier. My advice would be to be open to new opportunities and say yes, right? So, I can share my own personal experience. I've been in this business for over 12 years now. My way into this business was maybe like a lot of hours, I guess, non-traditional. I didn't know anything about recruiting. I had a good friend of mine that kind of landed his way into this business as well. And he called me 3 months into his role as an IT recruiter and said, hey, do you want to come over here and do this? It's something different. It's really exciting. It's challenging. It's got all the things I want in terms of growth and income potential. So I said, sure. So I think that applies to candidates too, right? Whether it be something as simple as changing industry or learning a new tool or technology, be open to the opportunities and take them when they arise and say yes, right? Even if it's an interview with a company that maybe you're not thrilled about it, but you're looking for a job and you need practice interviewing. I always tell people, take the interview, make the connection, have the conversation. So that'd be my 2 things. Be open to opportunities and say yes.
Okay, so Greg and Evan, it's been absolutely wonderful spending time with y'all, sharing some tips and tricks for candidates of how to prepare for an interview, both working with a firm such as AccruePartners, as well as if they're interviewing on their own. it still applies. You just don't always have the same amount of information.
Yep.
And I think candidates need to know, once again, if you're looking for some documents to help you move through this process, we do have them on the Accrue Partners website. And again, thank you for your contributions today.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks for everybody tuning in to another episode of Building People, Companies, and Careers.